Hi, my name is Sam Du Bois. I am a senior lecturer at the School of Music, Theatre and Art at Örebro University in Sweden. And what I'm going to be talking about today is my presentation entitled Masculinism and Music Online. I just want to say first and foremost, I know it's really tacky to be doing a presentation for a music conference with guitars and a banjo behind me. It's not to prove I can play an instrument or I do play an instrument, it's because it's the only room in the house that doesn't have a screaming child or a screaming cat, so that's why I'm doing it here. So what I'm going to be talking about today is what other people have termed masculinism as a specific kind of ideology and its relationship to the so-called manosphere. So what I want to look at is how music is discussed in masculinist and manosphere forums. So in order to do this, I'm going to go through what I mean by masculinism and the manosphere first. I'm going to come on to describe the method a little bit and the sample that kind of was generated from this study, and then go on to outline the quantitative trends, which based more on content analysis, and then finally come back to the more kind of qualitative trends in terms of what are the ways in which music is being discussed in these forums and which music specifically are being discussed. So I think it's important first to make a conceptual distinction between masculinism and masculinity. So masculinism is essentially an ideology which asserts that there are two sexes, that they are diamorphically opposed, and essentially it borrows heavily from kind of social Darwinist and evolutionary discourses to make normative judgments about the way society should be. So there's a lot of kind of discussions within masculinist thought about the way in which men should behave. And often this tends to presume that masculinity is not only natural, but actually is a kind of force for some kind of moral right in the world. So you see in this way that it's kind of often been heavily linked to far-right groups inherently, because it presumes that men are, masculine men, I should say, are inherently stronger, but also that this kind of strength and domination is both morally superior and a kind of natural state of being. But it also divides the world in terms of thinking about men who are naturally stronger, men who are naturally kind of alpha, and men who are beta. So again, you get this borrowing of evolutionary inspired discourses to not only make a point about the way in which they presume the world is, but also the way the world should be. And as I say, this has been linked to far-right movements historically. Fascist movements in Italy, for example, in the 1920s, Nazi Germany in the 1930s, have often emphasized the dimorphic nature of different gendered roles, but also assumptions about the way in which men should behave. I would argue that these kind of discourses have seen a resurgence in recent years, amongst others, essentially which can be witnessed in the growth of what Emma Jane has referred to as cyber hate and vitriol directed against women, but also in terms of these sites that have sprung up in terms of discussing the so-called crisis of masculinity and this idea that men and masculinity are under attack and in decline. Okay, so one of the places that obviously these masculinist discourses have seen a resurgence in recent years is the so-called manosphere. Many of you will be familiar with the term the manosphere, but it's essentially a collective way of describing a group of forums, a group of subreddits that have sprung up around the issue of discussing how men and masculinity are either under attack or in crisis today. And central to masculinism within these spaces is this idea that masculinity is in crisis, but also it's something that's been related to the rise of feminism. For example, they see feminism as a kind of largely hegemonic global force now. It isn't, but okay. So these have been linked a lot of the time to gaming forums and online spaces that have typically tended to be the preserve of men, and specifically young men, I would argue. So as I say, with regards to Reddits and subreddits, you have the growth of the Red Pill, which is probably one of the most famous ones. You have also the kind of subreddits around incel subcultures. You also have a lot of the kind of gaming forums which take on this very misogynistic, anti-feminist character from the perceived threat to gaming culture generally is a young men's preserve. There's also, so studies from 2019 and 2020 have also shown that there is significant overlap between users, specifically Reddit users in different forums and different subreddits, But also you see this kind of mainstreaming, where you see this driving of traffic from the more mainstream social media sites like YouTube and Facebook to these forums. So there is an overlap here between what has often been referred to as the intellectual dark web and people being streamed into these channels through being recommended videos or recommended certain topics on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, as a way of kind of coming into these spaces. So partly it's organic and partly it's also being gamed by certain interest groups. So the question is, well, what does this have to do with music, given that we are, albeit virtually, at a music conference? So originally my research was focusing on looking at the articulation of anti-feminist and misogynistic discourses within the manosphere and within these online forums. And one of the things that I noticed was that more and more music was kind of coming into the discussion as to what types of music people should be listening to, but also how certain types of music supported different types of masculinist ideologies or feminist ideologies or whatever. And I think in order to explain the role that music has to play in these sites and the way in which music is a way of locking people into discussions about kind of broader far-right politics, you have to understand this in terms of a broader context and the shift towards respectability politics amongst the far right and generally. Now, Mondon and Winter in their book Reactionary Democracy have shown how extreme right and far right ideas have increasingly become more mainstream. And one of the ways in which they have become more mainstream is through a discussion of how culture supports certain ideological positions. So here you have the kind of influence of left-wing and specifically Gramscian thoughts about hegemony and the idea of culture as a prerequisite to engaging in politics, actively being used through this kind of concept of metapolitics within far-right movements more generally. Benjamin Teitelbaum makes this kind of case directly in relation to music with regards to the Swedish far right and the extreme right, where he shows that actually there's been this kind of distancing from these obviously kind of Nazi, obviously far right and fascist aesthetics in order to make far right messaging palatable to a wider range of people. So you have this kind of weird marriage in Teitelbaum's work of white nationalism with hip-hop, which is something I'll come back to later anyway. But the other thing that you have is also the active gaming of the sorting algorithm within specifically subreddits and Reddit generally, but also other kinds of forums. So essentially upvoting or downvoting makes a post or a topic more prominent or less prominent. So in this way, kind of discussions of music and discussions of culture generally are more likely to attract a wider audience than if you couch your posts specifically in kind of terms of explicit white nationalist or explicitly misogynistic language. So if you start talking about, for example, which music is more red pill, it is more likely to attract clicks than if you start saying explicitly kind of misogynistic or explicitly racist things. What's also interesting, I think, is amongst the alt-right is the way in which, as various other people have shown, the kind of growth of irony and meme culture has seen a repurposing of established cultural symbols, and specifically, you know, Pepe the Frog is the kind of big figure for the alt-right. I think one of the things that you have that's quite important to look at now is the way in which the deliberate obfuscation of what counts as a Nazi symbol involves the kind of repurposing of mainstream cultural figures. Most famously, Taylor Swift has for years amongst the alt-right been kind of linked to this conspiracy theory that she is secretly a white nationalist, or that she is secretly pushing these kind of masculinist and white nationalist messages through her music. And actually she has Reddit subreddits that are dedicated to her, as well as Facebook pages where she is kind of hailed as an Aryan goddess. So partly this is, partly this is obviously an attempt to muddy the waters a little bit, but partly this is also an attempt to repurpose various cultural symbols in order to show that these people who are kind of big icons are also perhaps engaged in the same kind of issues. So you just need to look below the surface and read these musicians in a certain way in order to understand their messages. You also have the intersection of masculinist politics with discussions of music more explicitly in texts by alt-right intellectual figureheads. So Jordan Peterson's international bestseller 12 Rules for Life makes this case explicitly. So he argues, When a lobster that has just lost a battle is exposed to serotonin, it will stretch itself out, advance even on former victors and fight longer and harder. That same brutal principle of unequal distribution applies outside the financial domain, indeed anywhere that creative production is required. Similarly, just 4 classical composers, Bach, Beethoven, Mozart and Tchaikovsky, wrote almost all the music played by modern orchestras. Bach, for his part, composed so prolifically that it would take decades of work merely to hand copy his scores, yet only a small fraction of this prodigious output is commonly performed. So again, you have this linking of masculinism as a kind of morally correct ideology with the assumption that this also explains the cultural superiority of Western classical music. Now, it's kind of debatable whether or not Tchaikovsky counts as part of the Western canon, but essentially here, what they're trying to do is create a kind of discourse that masculinity is responsible, and specifically kind of men's creative production, is responsible for the cultural superiority of Western music. So I started with 2 questions. The first was, what are the types of music that are mentioned most often? Who are the musicians, who are the bands, who are the artists that are mentioned most often in these forums? And the second is, what are the ways in which value judgments about music are formed? So I looked at 5 manosphere forums between 2010 to 2018, looking specifically at discussions of music. So this was kind of discussions in a broad sense, but mostly focus on what types of music were people recommending, what types of music did people express preferences or distaste for. So I excluded discussions, for example, around gender equality and festival lineups, discussions about how to pick up women at gigs, and all those kinds of things. One of the things that you'll first notice is, from graph 1, is that the peak of post 383 was actually in 2016. Now, I would strongly hypothesize that this is due to the election of Donald Trump and the increased media coverage that these sites were actually getting in the US specifically around this time. So there is actually evidence that traffic is being driven to these sites by increased media coverage, but also a kind of broader focus on discussions of more kind of cultural issues rather than the US presidential election or the Brexit election specifically. The second thing to notice is that Forum 1 has a greater number of posts that discuss music specifically. This is owing to the fact that Forum 1 is kind of more focused on so-called cultural rather than political issues. Whilst I don't generally like to divide that into culture and politics, there is a kind of an attempt to actually influence debates about politics by specifically talking about music rather than vice versa. In terms of the artists that were mentioned most commonly, so what this table shows is the artists that were mentioned most often and whether or not the majority of value judgments about them were positive or negative. So the plus or the minus essentially indicates whether the majority were positive or negative. So what this table shows is that Eminem was by far the most mentioned artist, and almost unanimously all the posts were kind of positive about him. Secondly, Kanye West, perhaps a bit more split, but the overall kind of majority positive mentions about him. But then you have the negative mentions about, definitely not coincidentally, you have majority negative mentions about women identified artists in this. So with the exception of Lana Del Rey, who garnered quite a lot of support for her kind of what was perceived to be her anti-feminist take. Now, whether or not her songs are actively anti-feminist or not is not the point. The point is the fact that they were being interpreted in this way in line with this kind of broader masculinist politics. So when looking at the genres that were mentioned most often, what you have here is that overwhelmingly artists that self-define themselves as metal artists or discussions of metal generally were the most commonly mentioned music genre, followed closely by pop and then rock and then hip-hop and rap. Now when you take rap and hip-hop together, there were 266 mentions, whereas there were only 219 mentions for metal, which was the second highest. So it's clear here that metal, hip-hop and rap had not only the most mentions but also the most positive mentions or the most positive discussions attached to them. Whereas when you look at discussions around pop music, the majority of posts were discussing the kind of negative connotations about pop music. In terms of the value judgments that are actually expressed about
why music was important and what different types of music were important. Again, you have the influence of this kind of evolutionary inspired discourse through the use of the terms alpha and beta and red pill and blue pill. So red pill and blue pill are obviously references to the Matrix film, where taking the red pill allows you to see the world for what it really is. And in this case, what they see the world as, or what the world really is according to this group of people, is this kind of feminist dystopia where men are subordinated. So taking the red pill in this case is seen as wising up to this, and essentially this kind of act of masculinist kind of consciousness raising. And I'll get back to that in a second. But if you look in terms of the way in which preferences are discussed, there is not only hostility against music that is seen to be promoting kind of feminist agendas or women's kind of superordinate position as they see it in society generally, but also this kind of hostility against men who actually write kind of love songs about women. So, for example, the first post says, "I can't stand female supporting beta dudes. Any guy who listens to shit gynocentric pop and believes that girls are goddesses won't like good music." So again, this hostility is not only directed at women, but also about men who are seen as supporting this kind of feminist agenda. Secondly, the beta is way worse when love songs are written by men. Thirdly, things went downhill when people gave up respecting technical playing proficiency and limp-wristed beta guys became the standard in the 90s. Metallica is probably the best example. So here you have the assumption that actually civilizational decline, or the kind of decline in the crisis of masculinity that's been supported by these so-called beta men, is something which can be revealed by looking at music that is written by men about women. One thing that was interesting that appeared in the data was that 44 posts actually mentioned what I've termed here kind of conversion stories. Now, these were discussions about the fact that people had either previously been in certain music that they hadn't been able to engage with since becoming involved in these forums, or these kind of rereading of music that people were previously into in light of the type of politics they were introduced to in these forums. So taking these three quotes, "Yeah, as soon as I got pilled, it ruined my favourite songs. I just pretend singers are ironic when they're droning on about how basic some girl is." Second quote, "I love music, so it's no wonder I was completely brainwashed into beta behaviour for so many years, even though my dad's an alpha male with a really alpha job." And the third one, "As the red pill slowly starts to filter into my system, I admit I've started listening differently. Some stuff I enjoyed a while back, I now think is almost repulsive." In a direct inversion of what has been commonly associated with left-wing movements, for example, feminist consciousness raising, actually what you have through engagement with these masculinist politics in these forums is actually a forced re-evaluation of different types of music that people previously listened to, but now read something totally different as a result of their engagement with these forums. Also, in a similar way to, as I pointed out earlier, Taylor Swift's appropriation by the alt-right and the extreme right, what you have here is people looking for recommendations of what they term mainstream music, which doesn't have a necessarily far-right aesthetic, I would say. So, if you take the first quote, "Carly Rae Jepsen is fucking fabulous. She doesn't buy into all that girl power bullshit. Boy Problems is totally about how she's the problem." So, what you have in this quote and the subsequent quotes is the idea that they are looking for music which doesn't actually necessarily espouse anti-feminism or doesn't espouse white nationalism overtly, but still had these kind of coded references to these kind of anti-feminist aims specifically. But what's interesting about this is, whilst the majority of the negative mentions about pop music, for example, were often focused on the fact that it was seen as to be promoting feminism or femininity generally, and seen to be from a woman's standpoint, there was actively a kind of embrace of women musicians who were seen to be promoting the aims and values of the masculinist movement. But whilst, as I pointed out at the start, the masculinism and white nationalism are not necessarily the same ideology, the following quotes demonstrate that the case that there is actually quite a great deal of overlap between the slide between anti-feminist politics and then the slide into white nationalist politics. So specifically, there were discussions of National Socialist black metal bands like Burzum, and there were also discussions of the so-called degeneracy of black music, which obviously has its roots in this kind of Nazi rhetoric around degeneracy and racial hygiene. So taking the first quote, "Dudes like Vari Vikernes get labelled racist. I think he's just the kind of thing that Europe needs, what with everything going on with that migrant crisis. Quote 2 again makes reference to notions of degeneracy, which again, as I've pointed out, has its roots in this kind of social Darwinist Nazi rhetoric. So I'm not going to stick my neck out for every black musician out there, but I think it's a bit much calling all of them degenerate. It's the record labels that spread degeneracy. I'm not going to say who owns them because I try to avoid talking about race nowadays, but I mean, come on, fellas. So again, here you have the implicit assumption that there is some kind of puppet master who is deliberately fostering this kind of degeneracy in black music, which is made clear in the third quote that it's actually talking about Jewish people. Now, obviously, this is a kind of trope that is directly borrowed from white nationalism. If we take a look at the last quote, hip-hop is really superficially alpha male. But in my opinion, it's all about the fact that their culture is lacking in male role models. That's significant. Now, what's interesting about these quotes is actually that there is an attempt to frame this more in terms of culture than of race, but the two essentially become synonymous. Now, this is what Mondon and Winter describe as this kind of liberal racism. So the mainstreaming of illiberal racisms, the type of racist white nationalist ideology that's associated with the far right, actually creeping its way into discussions amongst people that perceive themselves to be talking about culture but are essentially pointing towards the same kind of tendencies. So again, here in these forums, what you have is these kind of discussions of music, not only talking specifically about anti-feminist politics, but also the relationship between different groups of men and which men should be presumed to be more hierarchically superior. Essentially what this presentation has tried to show is that unegalitarian masculinist politics are increasingly being promoted through discussions of music within manosphere forums. I'm not trying to suggest that this is necessarily solely as a result of deliberate manipulation, although there is some clear evidence that there are vested interests which have been manipulating different kind of sorting algorithms within these forums in order to promote certain discussions. But also they are organic in the sense that people are more likely to be engaged in discussions about music and culture generally rather than about politics. In this case, you see this kind of clear evidence of a meta-political strategy which is prevalent amongst the new right in general today, where they search for this kind of respectability politics through framing discussions around culture first and then drawing people into the politics later. In this way, discussions of music function to both convert and recruit people to certain ways of thinking without drawing explicitly on extremist or far-right aesthetics. So there were very few discussions, for example, of National Socialist bands, and very few discussions of kind of explicitly racist lyrics, but there were definitely a rereading of certain racist tropes in existing mainstream artists. In this way, they're kind of indebted, I would say, this kind of way of rereading is indebted to feminists and critical theorists who have often argued for the idea that you can understand culture's ideological impulse through analysing music. So I think that this is being played out here in a direct inversion of the kind of critical theory tradition. But there are also, with regards, whilst masculinism and white nationalism are not necessarily the same, there is a significant degree of overlap between these movements. And what you see is this, in the coded racisms, evident this respectability politics. So you have on the one hand these kind of more explicit racist conspiracy theories around Jewish people owning record labels, around the degeneracy of black music, but also you have these kind of more coded examples of people talking in terms of culture as a way of promoting more and more extreme racist ideas.